IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Prasanna Naidu and today we are going to talk about the Russia-Ukraine issue. But before we begin, if you are really interested in this topic and topics like these, then you must surely consider taking up our Defense and Foreign Affairs course, which is just for 3 months. And we also offer specialized courses in tech and policy and health and life sciences. For more details, visit the link in the show notes. Okay, so with the 30th anniversary of the collapse of Soviet Union approaching, and with a significant Russian military buildup on Ukraine's border, there are renewed fears that Russia might invade. There is a sharp rhetoric about non-expansion of NATO in the east and the need for Russia to receive legal security guarantees to the effect. To unpack the recent developments and possible scenarios in which the crisis may pan out, I have with me today Takshishila's All Things Russia guy, Aditya Pareek.
Thanks, Prasanna. It's great to be here.
So, to start with, Aditya, can you give our listeners a quick rundown of the current crisis until now? Like, why is Russia on Ukraine's border with such, a military buildup?
Sure, Prasanna. So I believe objectively the crisis doesn't really have a starting point. And, when you say that why Russia is on the border of Ukraine, well, they're both post-Soviet republics. They're both post-Soviet countries. They were once part of the Soviet Union. And they were part of the Russian Empire. So they're neighbors geographically. And as Russia and the Kremlin's functionaries like to point out that the troops are still on Russia's own terrain and they're not breaking any international laws or they're doing anything out of the ordinary by being on their own territory, no matter the size of the buildup. Because if a country...
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but I just remembered something I read. Like, question like this was asked, like, why is Russia, taking so many military troops at the Ukraine border? So Putin replied, like, we can do anything in our territory. Right? So that was something. Okay.
Peskov also did that.
Oh, okay.
But the point is, geographically, since the countries are neighbors and they were part of the same political union during the Soviet times, and before that, too, they were part of the same empire, the Russian Empire. So the Russian troops being on the Ukrainian border is just part of Russia's own view of its security. So, there are political goals that have to be achieved by other means. As Clausewitz says, war is politics by other means. The same concept applies here. So, I don't believe the current crisis is very unique. And I objectively believe that it doesn't really have a starting point. It's a slow boil. And as it's common knowledge that the eastern parts of Ukraine, which are dominated by some separatists in the east of Ukraine who are Russian speaking population, and they feel that they should be part of another political entity rather than Ukraine. So those areas are, troubled ever since the events of 2014 in Crimea. So it's common knowledge that Donbas, the region is called Donbas, and its two constituent entities, the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, those regions in eastern Ukraine are under the shadow of a frozen conflict. So the frozen conflict between those separatists who are Russian speaking and are quite amenable to Moscow. And then there are the Ukrainian military, their forces. There are also volunteer militias from the Ukrainian side who fight against those separatists. So it's a frozen conflict in the sense that there's a stalemate. No one side has prevailed. Those separatists have not been defeated and those territories been taken over by the Ukrainian regime in Kyiv. Neither has Moscow given these separatists complete support, overt support. So it remains a conflict that's frozen. And there are two agreements which have been negotiated between the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the separatists which are, as I said, quite amenable to Moscow. So those agreements are called the Minsk Protocol, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 agreement. And they were negotiated under the Normandy format, which is basically a dialogue platform where the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the separatists meet under mediation by EU member states, so namely Germany and France.
Mm.
So, since the first meeting, as far as I remember, happened in France, the dialogues are called the Normandy format because of that. So, these meetings have happened in different places, but including Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus. So, these agreements were supposed to be a series of measures which both sides of this frozen conflict would implement, and this would first result in a ceasefire, then a disengagement between forces, and then pullback of forces, and then removal of certain types of weaponry, all heavy weaponry, howitzers and artillery guns, rocket launchers, that sort of a thing would be removed from the active battlefield, and then only small arms would be there. Then those would be pulled back, and that sort of a thing. So it was a gradual de-escalation and then a resolution of the conflict kind of a deal. But the ceasefire doesn't even hold. So the first step of the whole equation has not been implemented. That's why two of these agreements have been negotiated, but they've been to no effect. All of these negotiations have failed to deliver any results in terms of peace to the region. So the Normandy process still goes on. And recently, there was even talk of the United States joining the platform. And if I recall correctly, the Russian MFA is a representative, I think, a Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, who's quite been in the news about something that we'll talk forward in this podcast. So those formats are unlikely to deliver anything, I believe. But there was a similar crisis in April this year. There was a similar buildup, and there was a similar war scare, and there were all sorts of opinions and analysis floating around in the Western IR analysis spheres that there was going to be some sort of a kinetic conflict, and same as this time. But there were a lot of level-headed people who were thinking of these buildups in terms of coercive threat in being, for a lack of a better expression. So, as I alluded to in the beginning of the podcast, threat in being is exactly what the Clausewitzian concept of achieving political goals by other means refer to. So, if you can move all of your military strength to a certain part of your country, the country that feels threatened by it is supposed to make concessions about some demands or anxieties or worries that you might have. That threatened party would feel obliged to appease what you are asking of it. So it's that kind of a situation. I don't think it's a situation where a kinetic conflict is likely to break out. So as the April situation resolved, it fizzled out. Most of the troops, not all of them, went back to their respective garrisons, their respective military districts. So that spring build-up earlier this year ended with the Zapad exercises. So Zapad, the word means West. It was a multilateral exercise in which the Russian and the Belarusian forces took part. Even the Indian armed forces were invited to it, and some contingents did participate, as far as I know. So that build-up ended with major military exercise, but we knew around what time that was going to happen. So that fizzling out was kind of foreseeable, but this time, no similar exercise is supposed to be happening. And for a point, if I can recall that, yeah, this changed to the frozen conflict situation with regards to Eastern Europe and Russia, Ukraine dynamics about the frozen conflict. So I think around late October 26, 27, there was this news breaking out that Ukraine has taken delivery of Bayraktar TB2 medium altitude long endurance drones, which can carry ammunition and can strike targets. So you'd remember TB2 drones are the same ones which played a very important role on the battlefield between Azerbaijan and Armenia.
And yeah.
And there were reports that these UAVs, these drones, had struck targets in Donbass against the separatists. So I think that was a significant new development to call that this is a break from all the frozen conflict situation where there are casualties on both sides from heavy weapons, from small arms. that sort of a thing. And trench warfare still happens in Donbas. So something that began in the Russo-Japanese War 1904 to 1905, and people stopped believing that trench warfare was a thing, but Donbas is an exception.
Okay, so coming in here, considering the Azerbaijan and Armenia example, do you think Ukraine may have a upper hand in case of tensions if it builds up with a good quality and the amount of drones it has is more than Russia?
Well, drones aren't really an answer to combined arms warfare. So, Russia has many potent ballistic missiles that it can use to level the playing field. Excuse the pun and the expression, but they could literally knock out the bases from which those drones would be flying before they could ever be used tactically in combat. So the Iskander missiles, which would be used for such a purpose, have already been deployed to regions from which they can strike inside Ukraine at Ukrainian forces. So I don't think drones are the answer. Drones are the answer until the time that surface to air missiles don't come into action, which are quite potent. Although it's disputed because of the stuff that happened in Libya and Syria with the S-300 and the Panzer system. But those systems were in the hand of people who got the export versions of those systems. So I wouldn't discount the SAM systems in the hands of allegedly covertly supplied to separatists in Donbass and Russian forces, indeed, if they ever want to overtly act inside Ukraine. So I don't think that it would be a piece of cake like it was with Armenia or in Syria or Libya. So I don't think drones are a competitive advantage in that sense. It only works when the full might of the Russian armed forces aren't unleashed.
Okay, thanks for answering that question, but please continue from where you left.
So, after that, then came the sharp rhetoric from the Kremlin, then came the visit by the CIA director, William Burns, to Moscow. Because around that time, Antony Blinken and President Biden had almost started talking about the Russian buildup. And the CIA director visiting Moscow all of a sudden was catching headlines. So the rhetoric from the Russian side, from Moscow, about long-standing anxieties that Moscow has since the breakup of the Soviet Union, about the non-expansion of NATO eastward, and how things should go back to 1997, and all sorts of military hardware deployment should reflect those levels. So this is pre-Poland joining NATO, in fact. So it's pretty significant. Any of the Baltic states joining NATO. So it's pretty significant that how much of a rollback is going to be possible. Then came the security guarantees, the legal binding status of these desired security guarantees. And the thing that floored everybody is that the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs published two draft treaties, one a bilateral one that is addressed to the United States, and another one that is addressed to NATO. And those have this measure about the deployment of NATO forces going back to 1997, that the security situation should go back to at least that level. And that would be the point from which they would start negotiating. And interestingly, the Deputy Foreign Minister, Ryabkov, also said that this is not a menu where you can choose things a la carte, that you can pick and choose between them. This comes as a whole. We start negotiating with this as a whole. And today there was news that the Russian side believes that in early 2022, the US and the Russian side would be negotiating. So I think things are moving, but let's see. Let's see if the United States also confirms this and if a meeting indeed happens, which I believe would happen.
Okay. On that note, folks, we'll take a short break. Don't go anywhere, and we'll be right back.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Advertising is Dead, Varun talks to Anmol Gill, Head of Consumer Marketing at Bacardi India. They discuss the alco-bev industry, role of culture and marketing, and a whole lot more. On the Storytellers and Storysellers podcast, Vineet talks to Ambi and Bindu Subramaniam about the Sapa School of Music. They aim to make music learning more fun and accessible. Why is Google refusing to pull down a pro-suicide website? The Press Decode hosts analyze this piece of news. On Ikka Dukka Economy, Abhinav and Dr. Bharat Junjunwala cover everything there is to learn about IPOs. And on Say No to Drama, Chetna talks about how what-ifs could be a major barrier to most of your problems. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Go check out our YouTube channels. We go live on a whole bunch of different things. We have a number of different channels. You can find them on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, CoinSwitch Kuber, Intel, and Oxfam India. Thank you for making this possible.
Welcome back, folks. We are discussing the Russian buildup on the Ukrainian border. So, Aditya, what is your assessment? What would the US, UK, Germany, NATO, and Russia do? What are the possible scenarios in your opinion?
So, in my opinion, the US, the UK, and Germany, I do not believe that they're going to send their troops to actually fight any sort of kinetic conflict in Ukraine. And the United Kingdom's Defense Secretary, Captain Ben Wallace, has already given a statement about it's unlikely that UK's troops would be sent to fight in Ukraine. And President Biden also, in reply to a journalist's question, clarified that no, it's unlikely that we'll send troops, but we would possibly send military material to Ukraine if an aggression actually happens against them on their territory. So I think the basic measure that the West would take would be further sanctions on Russia if a kinetic conflict breaks out. And this would have, well, it's been advertised as such, I'd say it's been called as such, the nuclear option by cutting Russia off from the SWIFT to fund transfer messaging service, which basically is the majority of the world's financial system uses to notify each other's banks for financial transfers internationally. So if Russia would be cut off from that, to the West believes that would be a very devastating measure, and to some extent it would be. But there are other things that countries amenable to Russia who still want to trade with Russia, engage with Russia in economic activity would switch to. So there are other alternatives to SWIFT, and there would be trade embargoes, there would be import embargoes that Russia can't import. So this morning there was news about how smartphone imports to Russia would be constrained by certain sanction measures that Western countries are mulling. Maybe the Nord Stream 2 pipeline would also be halted, which is currently, being negotiated in terms of. So the physical pipeline is, as far as I know, complete, but it's still due for clearance by the regulators of the European Union, after which it would actually come into operation. So there's some stuff about the supplier and the distributor have to be different. It can't be the same vendor, as far as I know. So Gazprom, the Russian hydrocarbon company, which is a conglomerate with a long reach, I would say, internationally. So they are a big part of Russian foreign policy, and if there is fallout, it's going to be primarily financial for Moscow. I don't think there's a military situation in which there would be a direct conflict between Western forces and the Russian forces. So Russia have several options at its disposal, but I think a coercive buildup is pretty much the direction they're heading into, and there's going to be no kinetic conflict. And well, the West is just taking precautions with the kind of sanction measures that they're thinking of.
But the Nord Stream 2 thing which you were talking about, this is the pipeline from Russia to Germany, right?
Yeah.
And it is not yet operational also. But considering the costs it has incurred till now, wouldn't it be a huge loss to Russia if this project gets delayed? Especially also after all these Western powers put sanctions?
Yeah, definitely. So the 2014 sanctions and the sanctions ever since, because of many things that the West believes have been, active measures against the West by Russia and its functionaries of various kinds, some spies and some shadow actors, that sort of a thing. So there was a alleged poisoning of a dissident. There was alleged poisoning of a former intelligence operative of Russia who defected to the West, that sort of a thing. So in reply, there were sanctions and they've been devastated the Russian economy has been devastated by those sanctions. There have been major losses. The ruble got devaluated quite a bit, to the point that today, if you check the exchange rate, it almost is one Indian national rupee is equal to one Russian ruble. So a devaluation of the ruble is pretty much reflective of what the financial fallout has been for Russia since 2014. So Western sanctions would definitely take a toll. And there have been, many sectors. It's not just about imports. It's also about not finding stuff to substitute to components for vital things. So, for example, certain satellites that Russia's state to space company Roscosmos is supposed to be launching, they couldn't find integrated circuits for certain components in those satellites. And this has been brought up by the Director General of Roscosmos in the State Duma, their parliament. So I think it's pretty clear that the sanctions, well, they have learned to live with it. They've learned to endure, but it's definitely not an ideal situation. And going forward, if more sanctions are imposed, it's not going to be a good situation for Russia.
Okay, are there any specific arguments that you think in popular analysis are detached from logic but are still being perpetuated by many experts in the West and Russia about the current crisis and situation?
Well, honestly, one argument that has been on my mind and it doesn't sit well with me is the fact that certain Western analysts who I, respect profoundly and I care for their opinion and I love their scholarship, but they keep repeating this point about to President Putin having special regard for anniversaries of important historical events in Russia's history. So, for example, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 30th anniversary is coming up, and they have tried to make this argument that a certain offensive might be launched against Ukraine on that date because it signifies a very pivotal moment in Russian history. So in President Putin's mind, it could be something that could also usher in kind of a reclaiming of the high status that Russia should command in the hierarchy of nations. So that has not sat well with me, to be quite honest. And there are, general points about there being some sort of a diabolical design instead of genuine security anxieties for Russia, that we're feeling encircled and we're feeling that our traditional sphere of influence, where we've been comfortable that, yes, these are a set of amenable nations which are compatriot states to us, the former Soviet states, they feel that the West has encroached there, their influence is encroached there. So the anxiety is understandable, but I don't really see the West having a very amenable view in this regard to Russia.
Okay. So finally, what is the most likely scenario in which this crisis may be resolved? So from what I get, mostly Russia is not, planning to have a full-fledged war. But yeah, what do you see ahead?
So, as I've alluded to before in answers to previous question, I think it's a coercive buildup which Russia would keep the pressure on. And I think it's going to happen that so Russia has a conscription system and Russia has volunteer troops as well. So there's going to be a cycle of buildups. There's going to be a normative, new normal kind of a thing where exercises would be increased and the duration between the downtime for them would be decreased. So every few weeks, you're going to see a new buildup. You're going to see new exercises, and there are people are going to cry wolf. So I think a coercive buildup is going to become a new normal in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe. And there are going to be measures of all kind. And I believe that there's going to be further talks. There's going to be engagement between Russia and the West and other security partners in Europe. And it's going to be at the UN as well as bilateral and multilateral forums where these parties can meet and discuss the European security situation. And in some scenario, it might also be possible that certain missiles might be deployed by both sides to save face in a sort of, I don't know, reverse Cuban Missile Crisis kind of a deal. That might happen. But let's see how things might pan out, because there's plenty of opportunity for escalation, but I don't think that anybody is 100% ready for a escalation ladder kind of a situation. people are just going to coerce each other in the Euro-Atlantic security situation. And I think, yeah, this crisis would also fizzle out eventually, as long as, both sides engage. So through dialogue is the only way you can hope for the best possible outcome. But let's see.
Okay, on that note, folks, we'll call it a wrap. If you like today's discussion, don't forget to check out all past and future episodes of All Things Policy. And one announcement I had to make is that we won't have episodes on 30th and 31st December 2021, that is this month, because of the New Year's Eve. And that's it for today's episode.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Do you like true crime stories? Do you like to learn about the people behind some horrible, awful crimes? More specifically, women that may have committed these crimes. Actually, Indian criminals that are women? Then we'd like to welcome you to our podcast, Misconduct. My name is Raghavi. And I am Nisha. We cover themes like murder, dacoity, drug trafficking, financial fraud, kidnapping, and many more. You can catch us every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcast.
Eventually, you'll see the end of your childhood,
Get accustomed to womanhood.
enjoy the experience of sisterhood,
Might get to wifehood
or not, choose motherhood,
or not. You'll learn to define your personhood.
earn a livelihood,
Change the neighborhood.
and get rid of the falsehood that life post-academia is easy.
So join me, Natasha,
And me, Ayushi,
on a journey from station starting point
to station, what now?
next station, Pudin station, and hopefully Agla station, adulthood.
Fresh episodes out every Thursday.